The Pacific Northwest highways stretch for hundreds of miles through complete darkness, where the only company most truckers have is their headlights and whatever's waiting in the shadows beyond them. What would you do if you drove the same mile of highway for 3 hours without moving forward? How would you react if you opened your trailer to find something alive that shouldn't be there? Tonight, we're diving into 11 encounters that happened on these isolated roads, where professional drivers faced things that made them question everything they thought they knew about the open road. From I-5 to Route 101, these highways hide secrets that only reveal themselves when you're alone at 3 a.m. with nowhere to run. Some of these truckers quit their jobs the next day. Others still drive these routes, knowing what's out there. The question is, would you keep driving? This is Verified Fears, and by the time you reach Story 11, you'll understand why some stretches of highway are driven in complete silence. Stay until the end, because the final story will change how you see every exit ramp you pass. Let's hit the road. I've been driving freight for 17 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. Blizzards that turned windshields into white walls, fog so thick you could taste it. Black ice that made a 70,000-pound rig dance like a figure skater. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on I-5 between Ashland and Medford on a Tuesday night in October. I still drive that route, but I won't lie to you. Every single time I pass mile marker 14, my hands tighten on the wheel, and I don't breathe easy until I'm well past it. It started normal enough. I'd picked up a load of electronics in Sacramento, heading north to Portland with a deadline that had me pushing through the night. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and I was making good time. Around 2 in the morning, I crossed into Oregon and started the climb through the Siskiyous. That's when I noticed my fuel gauge was sitting lower than I'd like. So I made a mental note to stop at the truck stop just past Ashland at exit 14. I'd fueled up there 100 times before. Nice folks, decent coffee, clean restrooms. Just another routine stop on a routine run. I came down out of the mountains and hit the flats heading toward Ashland, and that's when things started feeling off. Not wrong exactly, just off. You know that feeling when something's not quite right, but you can't put your finger on it? The highway looked normal. My gauges all read normal. The white dashed lines kept disappearing under my hood at the same steady rhythm they always did. But something in my gut was sending up flares. I've learned to trust that feeling over the years. It saved my life more than once. I glanced at my GPS and saw mile marker 14 coming up in about 2 minutes. I checked my odometer out of habit, something I do without thinking after nearly 2 decades on the road. It read 847,293 miles. I remember that number specifically because of what came next. I passed mile marker 14 and kept my eyes out for the exit. But the sign never came. No big deal. I figured maybe I'd miscalculated the distance. I'd catch it on the next marker. So I kept driving, watching the white lines eat up under my headlights, listening to some old Waylon Jennings on the radio. 3 minutes later, according to my clock, I passed mile marker 14 again. Now, I'm not a stupid man. I know that doesn't make sense. But I'm telling you what I saw. The exact same marker, same stretch of road, same everything. I checked my odometer, and it still read 847,293 miles. Not 847,295 or 847,296 like it should have been after 3 minutes of driving at 65 miles per hour. The exact same number. I felt my chest tighten, but I told myself I was just tired. Long haul will mess with your head sometimes, make you see things that aren't there. I shook it off and kept driving. 5 minutes later, mile marker 14 again. Same marker, same odometer reading, same song on the radio actually, which is when I really started to panic. I'd been listening to Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys when I first passed the marker, and now it was playing again. Same verse, same guitar lick. I grabbed my phone to check the time, and it read 2:17 a.m. It had read 2:17 a.m. the first time I passed the marker. My radio clock agreed. So did the clock on my dashboard. I did what any sane person would do. I pulled over to the shoulder, put on my hazards, and sat there trying to make sense of what was happening. My CB radio was quiet, which was unusual for that time of night. Usually, you've got at least a few drivers shooting the breeze, warning each other about smokies or weather ahead. But tonight, nothing. Just static. I keyed the mic and called out, asking if anyone could hear me. No response. Just that empty static that sounded like the universe holding its breath. I sat there for what felt like 10 minutes, going through every rational explanation I could think of. Maybe I'd fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing. Maybe I'd had a stroke. Maybe there was a gas leak in the cab making me hallucinate. But I felt fine. Alert. More alert than I'd felt in months, actually, because fear has a way of sharpening everything to a razor's edge. Finally, I decided to get moving again. I pulled back onto the highway and accelerated up to speed, determined to just power through whatever this was until I hit Medford. 3 minutes later, mile marker 14. I actually laughed when I saw it, one of those high, strangled laughs that doesn't sound like it came from your own throat. The odometer still read 8:47,293. The clock still read 2:17 a.m. Waylon Jennings was still singing about cowboys. I checked my fuel gauge, and here's the thing that really made my blood run cold. It hadn't moved. I'd been driving for what felt like 20 minutes, and my fuel gauge was reading exactly 3/4 full, same as when I'd first noticed it. I tried everything. I sped up to 85 miles per hour, way faster than you should ever push a loaded rig, and mile marker 14 still appeared every few minutes. I slowed down to 35, and same thing. I tried to exit at what should have been exit 14, but there was no exit. Just more highway, stretching endlessly in both directions, with that same mile marker appearing over and over like a sick joke. I tried turning around, actually attempted a U-turn in the median, which is insane and illegal and desperate. But I couldn't even do that. My steering wheel would only let me go forward, not left into the median, not right onto the shoulder for more than a few seconds, only forward. The worst part wasn't the repetition. The worst part was the growing certainty that I wasn't alone. I started noticing things in my mirrors. Shadows that moved wrong, shapes at the edge of my headlight range that disappeared when I tried to focus on them. Once, I swear I saw another truck behind me. But when I blinked, it was gone. The CB kept crackling with bursts of something that might have been voices, but sounded like they were coming from underwater or another dimension entirely. I stopped trying to call out. I stopped doing anything except driving, watching that same mile marker appear again and again, feeling time stretch out like taffy. I don't know how many times I passed mile marker 14, 50, 100. At some point, I stopped counting because counting implied that numbers still meant something. And in whatever hell I'd driven into, they clearly didn't. My fuel gauge never moved. My odometer never changed. The clock stayed frozen at 2:17 a.m. The same song played on a loop. Even though I tried changing stations, nothing else would come through. Just Waylon, singing about cowboys over and over until I wanted to rip the radio out of the dash. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it ended. I came around a gentle curve, and there ahead of me was mile marker 15. Not mile marker 14, 15. I actually cried when I saw it, tears streaming down my face as I kept driving, watching the markers count up like they were supposed to. 15, 16, 17. My odometer suddenly jumped forward, ticking up the miles I should have covered. My clock jumped too, and when I looked down, it read 10:43 a.m., not 2:17 a.m. Almost 9 hours had passed. I pulled into the first truck stop I found and called my dispatcher. Told her I'd had mechanical trouble and needed to rest. She was furious because I'd missed my delivery window. But I didn't care. I sat in that parking lot for 6 hours, drinking coffee and trying to convince myself I'd hallucinated the whole thing. But I couldn't explain the time. I couldn't explain the fuel, because my tank was still 3/4 full despite hours of driving. I couldn't explain the recording on my dash cam, which showed nothing but darkness and mile marker 14 flashing past over and over for 8 hours and 47 minutes straight. I finished that run eventually, made it to Portland, dropped my load, picked up another one heading south. But when I got to that stretch of I-5 between Ashland and Medford, I took exit 11 and drove through town instead. Took an extra 45 minutes, and I didn't care. I still do that, every single time. Because I've talked to other drivers since then. Quiet conversations in truck stops where nobody wants to speak too loud. And I'm not the only one. 3 other drivers I know have stories about that stretch of road. About time not working right, about mile markers that repeat, about hours that vanish or stretch or fold in on themselves like origami. The Highway Patrol doesn't want to hear about it. The State Transportation Department says there's nothing unusual about that section of road. But we know better. Those of us who drive the night shift, who spend our lives on these dark ribbons of asphalt stretching through the wilderness, we know the road has secrets. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, you find yourself trapped in one of them. Mile marker 14 is still there. I see it every time I take the long way around, sitting there innocent as anything, just another marker on just another highway. But I won't pass it again. Not at night. Not ever. Because time is supposed to move forward. And when it doesn't, when you're caught in a loop you can't escape, you realize how thin the line is between the world we know and whatever's on the other side. And trust me, you don't want to find out what's waiting there. They train you for a lot of things in this business. How to handle a jackknife on black ice. What to do if your brakes fail coming down a mountain grade. How to secure a load so it doesn't shift and turn your trailer into a death trap. But nobody trains you for the moment you realize the person you stop to help knows exactly what you're carrying. And they shouldn't. That's when you understand you're not dealing with a stranded motorist. You're dealing with someone who's been waiting specifically for you. It happened on Highway 101, about 20 miles south of Forks, Washington, in an area so remote that cell service is a joke and the only lights you see are your own headlights reflecting off the wet pavement. I was hauling high-end electronics from Seattle to a distribution center in Aberdeen, running behind schedule because of construction delays near Olympia. It was just past midnight. Raining hard enough that my wipers could barely keep up, and I was the only vehicle on that stretch of road. Or so I thought. I came around a curve and saw the van pulled off on the shoulder with its hazards flashing. Nothing unusual about that. People break down all the time, especially on these rural highways where maintenance is sparse and help is far away. As I got closer, I could see it was a white cargo van, newer model, and there was a guy standing next to it waving his arms. He looked distressed, and I'm not the kind of person who can just drive past someone in trouble. I've got a daughter who drives these roads sometimes, and I'd want someone to stop for her. So I slowed down, pulled onto the shoulder about 50 feet ahead of the van, and grabbed my flashlight. The rain was coming down in sheets as I climbed out of the cab, and the guy jogged up to me before I could even reach his vehicle. That should have been my first warning sign. People who are genuinely broken down usually stay with their vehicle. But I was tired, focused on my schedule, and not thinking clearly. He was maybe 40, wearing a rain jacket and jeans, and he had this desperate look on his face that seemed real enough at the time. "Thank God someone stopped," he said, rain dripping off his hood. "My alternator died and my phone's dead. I've been stuck here for an hour." Standard breakdown story, nothing suspicious. But then he said something that made my blood turn cold. "You're hauling electronics, right? Seattle shipment?" I froze. My trailer was unmarked. No company logos, no indication of what was inside. Just a plain white refrigerated trailer that could have been carrying anything from frozen food to furniture. "How do you know what I'm carrying?" I asked, and I heard my voice change, getting harder. His expression shifted too, dropping that desperate act like a mask he didn't need anymore. He smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knows they've got you exactly where they want you. "Because we've been tracking your load since you left the distribution center," he said. And then he added something that proved these weren't just random highway robbers. "You're 3 hours behind schedule because of that accident on I-5 near Tacoma. You should have been through here at 9, but here you are at midnight, right on time for us." I backed up toward my truck, but I wasn't fast enough. 2 more guys appeared from behind my trailer, moving quick and coordinated. They must have been hiding in the brush when I stopped. One of them was talking on a radio, using CB codes. 10-4, 10-20, Smoky report. He knew the lingo like he'd spent years on the road. Later I'd find out I was right. These were former truckers who turned to organized cargo theft, using their insider knowledge to target specific loads on remote stretches of highway. "Keys," the first guy said, holding out his hand. I wasn't about to give him anything. That load was worth close to $2 million, and I'd be liable for every penny of it. More importantly, I'd spent 23 years building my reputation in this industry, and I wasn't going to let some highway pirates destroy it in one night. So I did the only thing I could think of. I ran, not away from my truck, but toward it. I'm 56 years old and carrying about 40 extra pounds, but fear is a hell of a motivator. I made it to my cab, jumped in, and slammed the door just as one of them grabbed for it. I fired up the engine and heard them shouting, but I didn't wait to hear what they were saying. I dropped the hammer and that big diesel roared to life, 18 wheels biting into the wet pavement as I accelerated. In my mirror, I saw them sprinting back to the van. They weren't giving up. They were coming after me. And that's when I realized this wasn't just an opportunistic robbery. This was organized, planned, and they weren't going to let a $2 million load just drive away. The van's headlights appeared behind me faster than they should have. That thing was modified, running way hotter than any stock cargo van had a right to. I pushed my rig up to 70, which is insane on that stretch of 101 in the rain at night. The curves come fast, the shoulders drop off into ditches, and one wrong move means you're rolling. But 70 wasn't enough. The van closed the distance, and then I saw something that made my situation exponentially worse. A second set of headlights appeared ahead of me, coming from the opposite direction. They'd boxed me in. My CB crackled to life. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, driver. Pull over and we'll let you walk away." The voice was calm, professional, like we were negotiating a business deal instead of a highway robbery. I I grabbed the mic. Channel 9, emergency requesting any law enforcement on Highway 101 south of Forks. Nothing but static. They were jamming the signal somehow, blocking my ability to call for help. These guys weren't amateurs. They had equipment, coordination, and a level of sophistication that terrified me. The truck ahead of me started slowing down, trying to force me to brake. Behind me, the van was riding my bumper. I had maybe 30 seconds before they'd have me stopped, and once that happened, it was over. I knew these roads, though. I'd driven this route twice a week for 5 years, and I knew something they apparently didn't. About 2 miles ahead, there was a turnoff to an old logging road. Single lane, barely maintained, leading back into the Olympic National Forest. If I could make it there before they forced me to stop, I might have a chance. I watched my GPS, counting down the distance. 1/4 mile. The truck ahead was braking hard now, hazards on, trying to make me stop. The van behind me bumped my trailer, a warning tap that rattled my teeth. I gripped the wheel and made my decision. When the logging road appeared on my right, I yanked the wheel hard over without braking. 70,000 pounds of truck and trailer don't turn on a dime, especially not at 60 miles per hour in the rain. My trailer slewed sideways, tires screaming, and for a second I thought I was going to jackknife and roll. But the tires caught, the trailer straightened out, and I was on the logging road, branches scraping both sides of my truck like fingernails on a chalkboard. Behind me, I saw the van try to follow, but they were going too fast. They slid past the turnoff, brake lights flaring red in the darkness. The truck ahead kept going too, probably radioing the van to turn around. I had maybe 90 seconds before they'd be back on my tail. The logging road was narrow, rutted, and filled with potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. I couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead through the rain and the overhanging branches. But I kept going, pushing that truck down a road it had no business being on. The van's headlights reappeared in my mirror, bouncing wildly as it hit the rough road. They were gaining on me, but now I had an advantage. This was a single-lane road with no room to pass and nowhere to turn around. And I was driving an 80-foot-long, 40-ton battering ram. When I saw the narrow wooden bridge ahead, spanning a creek that was running high from the rain, I knew what I had to do. It was going to cost me my truck and probably my job, but it would save the load and maybe my life. I accelerated onto the bridge, and then, right in the middle, I locked up the brakes. The truck slid to a stop, completely blocking the bridge. Behind me, the van's headlights got closer, and I could hear their engine revving. I jumped out of the cab and ran into the forest, crashing through underbrush in complete darkness. I heard them shouting, heard the van's doors slam. But I also heard something else, the sound of old wooden bridge supports cracking under the weight of my fully loaded trailer. They must have heard it too, because the shouting changed from angry to panicked. I didn't stop running until I'd put half a mile between me and that bridge. When I finally looked back, I couldn't see the lights anymore. I pulled out my phone and miraculously had 1 bar of service. I called 911 and gave them my approximate location. Then I called my dispatcher and told her she'd better send someone with a very good tow truck. It took the sheriff's department 45 minutes to reach me and another 2 hours to secure the scene. My truck was still on the bridge, which was sagging but hadn't collapsed. The van was gone, but they'd left tire tracks and other evidence. The deputies told me I wasn't the first driver to report organized robbery attempts on that stretch of highway. There had been 6 incidents in the last 4 months, all targeting high-value electronics shipments. The FBI got involved eventually, and 3 months later, They arrested 7 people, including 2 former truckers who'd been feeding route information to the crew. My company covered the damages to the truck and gave me a bonus for protecting the load. But I'll tell you what they didn't cover. The nightmares. The way my heart races every time I see a broken-down vehicle on a dark highway. The paranoia that makes me check my mirrors every 30 seconds, looking for vehicles that might be following me. They didn't train me for that, and there's no insurance policy that covers it. I still drive Highway 101, but I don't drive it alone anymore. I run in convoys when I can, stay in constant radio contact with other drivers, and I never, ever stop for stranded motorists in remote areas anymore. I call it in and keep driving. Some people probably think I'm heartless for that. Let them. They haven't looked into the eyes of someone who knows what you're carrying and knows you're alone. They haven't realized that the Good Samaritan instinct we're all taught as kids can get you killed on the wrong stretch of road at the wrong time of night. The highway isn't just dangerous because of weather or mechanical failure. Sometimes the most dangerous thing out there is another human being who's decided that your load is worth more than your life. There's something about complete silence that the human brain wasn't designed to handle. We're wired for noise, for connection, for the constant hum of civilization, even when we think we want peace and quiet. When that all gets stripped away, when every form of communication just stops working and you're truly alone, your mind starts doing things to fill that void. Things you don't want it to do. Things that make you question what's real and what your isolation-starved brain is manufacturing to keep you company. I learned that on Highway 20 through the North Cascades on a Wednesday night in late September. The highway is already remote enough during the day, cutting through some of the most isolated wilderness in Washington state. But at night, it becomes something else entirely. Miles and miles of nothing but mountains, forests, and darkness so complete, it feels like you're driving through the void itself. I'd made the run dozens of times before without incident. This time was different. I was hauling machine parts from Seattle to Omak, running the night shift because the pay was better and the traffic was non-existent. My GPS showed 93 miles of Highway 20 ahead of me, mostly through North Cascades National Park, where there's nothing but wilderness and the occasional scenic overlook. Cell service on that stretch is spotty at best, but I had my CB radio, my satellite phone for emergencies, and all my digital systems running smoothly. At least, they were running smoothly when I entered the pass. The first thing that went was my phone. Not gradually, not with the usual fading bars that let you know you're losing signal. It just died. 1 second I was looking at 3 bars of service. The next second the screen went black, like someone had flipped a switch. I tried turning it back on. Nothing. Not even the boot screen. I figured the battery had died, even though it had shown 80% charge moments before. Annoying, but not alarming. I still had my CB and my GPS. 10 minutes later, my CB crackled once and went silent. I keyed the mic. "Breaker, breaker. This is westbound on Highway 20. Anyone copy?" Static. Not even normal static, but a kind of dead silence that felt wrong. I checked my radio settings, made sure I was on the right channel. Everything looked normal, but when I tried to transmit again, nothing happened. The radio was on. The power light was glowing green, but it was like shouting into a void. That's when I started feeling it. That prickle on the back of your neck that tells you something's off. I checked my dashboard and felt my chest tighten. My GPS was frozen. The screen still showed the map, showed my position on Highway 20, but the little arrow representing my truck wasn't moving. The mile marker wasn't updating. Time was ticking forward on the clock display, but the GPS acted like I was sitting still, even though I could feel the road passing beneath my wheels. I tried my satellite phone, the one piece of equipment that's supposed to work anywhere on the planet. Dead. The digital displays on my dashboard started flickering, numbers jumping randomly before settling on readings that couldn't be right. My speedometer said I was doing 45 when I knew I was doing 65. My fuel gauge bounced between full and empty. Even my odometer seemed confused, the numbers rolling backward for a moment before freezing completely. Every electronic device in my cab had stopped working in the span of 15 minutes, and I was entering the most remote stretch of the pass with no way to call for help and no traffic around me for miles. I hadn't seen another vehicle since I'd left the last small town, and I wouldn't see civilization again for at least another hour. Maybe longer, since my GPS was dead, and I couldn't tell exactly where I was on this long, winding stretch of mountain highway. The rational part of my brain tried to find explanations. Solar flare, maybe, or some kind of electromagnetic interference from the mountains. But electromagnetic interference doesn't kill battery-powered devices that are already on. It doesn't make your speedometer lie. And it doesn't explain the feeling I had, growing stronger with each passing minute, that I wasn't alone out here. I kept driving because there was nothing else to do. No turnoffs, no places to stop except narrow shoulders that dropped off into darkness. The road twisted through the mountains, and my headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the blackness that pressed in from all sides. Without my radio, without even the ability to check my phone, the silence in the cab became oppressive. I could hear things I normally wouldn't notice. The hum of my tires on pavement, the rattle of something loose in the trailer, my own breathing, too loud in the quiet. That's when I started seeing things at the edge of my headlights. Movement, just quick flickers that vanished when I tried to focus on them. Shapes that might have been trees or rocks or something else. My rational brain said it was tricks of light, shadows cast by my headlights hitting the trees and undergrowth at weird angles. But isolation does funny things to your mind, and I'd been alone in complete silence for almost 30 minutes now. No radio chatter, no phone calls, no GPS voice telling me what was ahead. Just silence and darkness, and the growing certainty that something was out there watching me. I saw the hitchhiker at mile marker 127, or at least I think it was mile marker 127 since my GPS was frozen and I was counting markers manually. He was standing on the shoulder, thumb out, wearing clothes that seemed wrong somehow. Too formal for a hiking trip, too clean for someone who'd been walking along a mountain highway. I slowed down instinctively, then caught myself. Every piece of common sense I had screamed not to stop. Not here, not now, not when every system in my truck had failed and I was completely cut off from the outside world. I passed him and looked in my mirror. He was gone. Not walking away, not turning around, just gone, like he'd never been there at all. My hand started shaking on the wheel. I told myself I'd imagined him, that my isolation-starved brain had conjured him up to break the oppressive loneliness. But I'd seen him clearly. Seen his face, his clothes, the way he'd looked directly at me as I passed. The animals came next. Deer standing in the middle of the road, dozens of them, their eyes reflecting red in my headlights. But they didn't move when I approached. They just stood there, perfectly still, watching my truck bear down on them. I hit the brakes and the air horn simultaneously, and they vanished. Not scattered, not bolted into the forest. They simply ceased to exist between one heartbeat and the next. The road ahead was empty like they'd never been there. I was breathing hard now, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew what was happening. I'd read about it in some trucker forum years ago. Isolation-induced hallucinations. When your brain gets cut off from external stimuli for too long, it starts generating its own. Visual hallucinations are common in extreme isolation, your mind manufacturing stimuli to compensate for the sensory deprivation. Knowing what it was didn't make it less terrifying. Because if I was hallucinating, how could I trust anything I was seeing? How did I know the road was real? How did I know the mountains on either side weren't closing in, that the highway wasn't leading me somewhere it shouldn't? I gripped the wheel tighter and focused on the white line at the edge of the road, using it as an anchor to reality. The figure standing in the middle of my lane appeared so suddenly, I didn't have time to react. It looked human, but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Too tall, proportions slightly off, movements too fluid. I yanked the wheel hard right, felt my trailer swing out, and for a terrible moment, I thought I was going to jackknife and roll. The tires screamed, the cab tilted, and I was certain this was it. This was how I died, chasing hallucinations on a mountain highway in the middle of nowhere. The truck straightened out. I was still on the road, still moving forward, my heart trying to punch through my chest wall. In my mirror, there was nothing. No figure, no skid marks, no evidence that anything had happened. But I'd felt the truck react. I'd felt the tires lose traction. That wasn't a hallucination. Or was it? Could isolation mess with your perception so completely that you'd feel things that weren't real? I started talking to myself, out loud just to hear a human voice. Didn't matter what I said. Weather observations, descriptions of what I was seeing, old song lyrics I could remember. Anything to fill the silence that seemed to be eating at the edges of my sanity. My voice sounded strange in the cab, too loud and too quiet at the same time, like the silence was absorbing it before it could fully form. Time stopped meaning anything. I might have been driving for an hour or 3 hours. My clock still worked, but I didn't trust it anymore. I didn't trust anything. The road kept unwinding ahead of me, curve after curve through mountains that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. I started counting my heartbeats just to have something concrete to focus on, something my brain couldn't manufacture or distort. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it ended. My phone buzzed to life in the cup holder where I'd tossed it. My CB crackled with someone talking about weather in Omak. My GPS unfroze and immediately started recalculating my route. The digital displays on my dashboard stabilized, showing normal readings. And I realized I was passing the Omak city limits sign. I'd crossed 93 miles of complete isolation without even realizing I'd reached the end. I pulled into the first truck stop I saw and sat in the parking lot for 2 hours. Just sat there with all my lights on, my radio playing, and other trucks around me. The dispatcher called asking why I'd gone dark for so long. I told her equipment failure, which was true enough. What I didn't tell her was that I'd spent those miles questioning reality, seeing things that couldn't be there, fighting off the kind of existential terror that comes from being truly, completely alone. I looked it up later. Electromagnetic anomalies in the North Cascades, documented cases of communication failures, magnetic interference from the mountain geology. All explainable, all rational. But that doesn't cover what I saw, what I felt, the certainty that something was out there in the darkness with me. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe isolation and sensory deprivation created every bit of it. But I drive Highway 20 during the day now, when I can see the mountains and other traffic and my phone has signal. Because here's what they don't tell you about the human mind. It's not built for complete isolation. Strip away all connection, all communication, all proof that other people exist, and your brain starts filling in the gaps. And sometimes, what it fills them with is worse than any real threat could ever be. The monsters in isolation aren't the things that might be out there in the dark. They're the things your own mind creates when it's left alone too long with nothing but silence and shadows. I don't believe in Bigfoot. Or at least I didn't until February of last year. I'm the kind of person who needs proof, physical evidence, something concrete before I'll accept that something exists. I spent 31 years driving trucks through every corner of the Pacific Northwest without seeing anything I couldn't explain. Bears, elk, cougars, sure. Strange lights in the sky that turned out to be satellites or aircraft. Plenty of those. But nothing that made me question the fundamental understanding of what lives in these forests. That changed on Route 12 through White Pass on a night when the snow was coming down so hard I could barely see 20 feet ahead of my truck. I was hauling timber equipment from Yakima to Chehalis, a run I'd made at least 50 times before. White Pass isn't an easy drive, even in good weather. The road climbs to over 4,000 feet elevation, winds through the Cascade Mountains with steep drop-offs and tight curves. And in winter, it's treacherous enough that a lot of drivers refuse to run it at all. But I grew up in these mountains. Learned to drive in snow before I learned to drive on dry pavement. And the pay for winter runs through the pass is good enough to make it worth the risk. The snowstorm hit about halfway through the pass, one of those sudden mountain squalls that turns the world white in minutes. My visibility dropped to almost nothing. Just the red glow of my taillights reflecting off the snow and the vague outline of trees on either side of the road. I slowed down to 30 miles an hour, which was probably still too fast, but stopping wasn't an option. There was nowhere to pull over, no chains on my tires, because the road had been clear when I started the climb, and turning around was impossible. The snow was hypnotic in my headlights. Thousands of flakes swirling and dancing, creating patterns that played tricks on your eyes. I'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes in whiteout conditions, my shoulders tense and my hands locked on the wheel, when something moved at the edge of my vision. Not the random movement of wind-blown branches or snow sliding off trees. Deliberate movement. Something large crossing the road from right to left, about 30 yards ahead. I hit the brakes instinctively, felt my trailer start to slide on the snow-covered pavement, and eased off before I lost control completely. My headlights caught it full on for maybe 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds burned into my memory with a clarity that still wakes me up at night. It was walking upright on 2 legs, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair that the snow was sticking to. The proportions were wrong for a human. Too broad through the shoulders and chest, arms that hung longer than they should. But it moved with purpose, with intelligence, placing each foot deliberately despite the deep snow. What froze me wasn't the size or the appearance. It was when the thing turned its head and looked directly at me. I saw its face in my headlights for less than a second. But I saw it clearly. Not a bear, not a person in a costume, not anything I had a reference point for. The eyes reflected light like an animal's. But the expression wasn't animal. There was awareness there, intelligence, recognition that I was looking at it just as much as it was looking at me. Then it was gone, disappearing into the trees on the left side of the road, like it had never been there. I sat there with my truck idling, snow piling up on my windshield faster than the wipers could clear it, trying to process what I'd just seen. My hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly, though there was plenty of that. More from the fundamental shock of seeing something that wasn't supposed to exist. My brain kept trying to rationalize it, a bear standing on its hind legs, a person in a very good costume playing a prank in the middle of a snowstorm at night. Anything that fit into the world I understood. But I've seen bears. I've seen them stand up, seen them move through the forest. This wasn't a bear? The gait was wrong. The proportions were wrong. Everything about it was wrong for any animal I knew. And no human, no matter how tall, moves through waist-deep snow with that kind of ease and power. I finally put the truck back in gear and continued down the pass, checking my mirrors every few seconds, like the thing might be following me. I made it to Chehalis around 5 in the morning, dropped my load at the distribution center, and drove to the nearest truck stop to fuel up and grab some coffee. I was exhausted, running on adrenaline and caffeine, and I still hadn't fully accepted what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the snow and the darkness, my tired brain manufacturing something that wasn't there. But I kept seeing those eyes, kept remembering the way it had looked at me with unmistakable intelligence. I was doing my post-trip inspection, checking my trailer for damage from the rough drive through the pass, when I found it. On the driver's side of the trailer, about 7 feet up from the ground, there was a handprint. Not a smudge, not an accidental mark. A clear, distinct handprint pressed into the metal hard enough to dent it slightly. The print was enormous, easily twice the size of my own hand, with 4 fingers and a thumb that left impressions deep enough that I could feel them when I ran my fingers over the metal. I stood there staring at that print for a long time, feeling something shift in my understanding of reality. The metal of my trailer was cold and the dent was fresh, created sometime during the night. There was no way I'd had that damage before I started the run, because I'd done a thorough inspection in Yakima, which meant something had touched my trailer while I was driving through White Pass. Something with hands large enough and strong enough to dent industrial-grade steel. I took photos with my phone, dozens of them from every angle. I measured the handprint with my tape measure. Palm width was 11 inches. Finger length was close to 8 inches from base to tip. The thumbprint angled differently than a human thumb would, more opposing, more flexible. I'm not a scientist, but I've been around enough to know that no human has hands that size or that strong, and no bear paw looks anything like what was pressed into my trailer. I didn't tell anyone right away. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself, and I had the physical evidence right there on my trailer. I finished my coffee, checked my route for the next load, and tried to act like everything was normal. But normal had shifted. I kept looking at those photos on my phone, kept going back to my trailer to make sure the handprint was still there, that I hadn't imagined it. About a week later, I was back through that area on another run. I stopped at a diner in Packwood, a little place called the Mountain View that's been there forever and serves breakfast all day. The waitress was an older woman, probably in her 60s, who'd lived in the area her whole life. I was sitting at the counter drinking coffee and working up the nerve to ask about what I'd seen when she noticed me staring out the window toward the mountains. "You see something out there?" she asked, refilling my cup without being asked. Her tone was casual, like she was asking about the weather. I hesitated, then decided I had nothing to lose. "I saw something on White Pass last week, during that big snowstorm, something I can't explain." She nodded like I'd just told her the daily special. "They're more active in winter," she said simply. "Snow makes the forest quiet, easier to move around without being heard." I stared at her. "They?" She smiled, a knowing smile that said she'd had this conversation before. "Honey, you're not the first driver to see them up there, and you won't be the last. This whole area, from White Pass through the Gifford Pinchot, It's their territory. Has been for longer than we've been here. Most folks don't talk about it because they don't want to sound crazy, but those of us who live here know. We've all seen signs. Tracks in the snow that don't match any known animal. Trees twisted and broken 8 feet off the ground. Sounds in the forest that don't fit anything natural. She said it so matter-of-factly, like she was discussing deer or elk, just another part of the local wildlife. I showed her the photos of the handprint on my trailer. She studied them carefully, then nodded. That's consistent with other evidence I've seen. You're lucky, actually. Most people just get a glimpse or find tracks. To have a clear sighting and physical evidence, that's rare. I asked her why more people don't know about this, why it's not bigger news. She shrugged. Who's going to believe it? You got evidence right there on your trailer, and I bet you haven't told anyone official, because you know how it sounds. She was right. I hadn't filed a report, hadn't called any wildlife authorities or research organizations. Because saying, I saw Bigfoot, and here's a handprint to prove it, sounds insane, even with photographic evidence. The scientific community dismisses these encounters as misidentifications or hoaxes. The media treats it as entertainment. And most people, like me before that night, simply don't believe these creatures exist despite decades of consistent reports from credible witnesses across the Pacific Northwest. But I know what I saw. I know what touched my trailer hard enough to leave a permanent impression in the metal. And I know that the forests of the Pacific Northwest contain things we don't fully understand. Species that have learned to avoid human contact so effectively that they might as well be ghosts. The handprint is still on my trailer. I never had it buffed out or repaired. It serves as a reminder that the world is stranger than we give it credit for, and that seeing something with your own eyes doesn't always mean others will believe you. I still drive Route 12 through White Pass regularly. Every time I make that run, especially in winter, I watch the tree line more carefully. I've never seen it again, whatever it was. But I've found tracks a few times in the snow at rest stops, massive footprints that stretch 18 inches long and show 5 distinct toes. I photograph them, measure them, add them to the collection of evidence on my phone that I know most people will dismiss as fabrication or misidentification. The thing is, I don't need them to believe me. I was there. I saw it. I have the physical evidence on my trailer that something touched my rig that night. Whether people call it Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or just an unknown primate species that science hasn't documented yet, I know it exists. I looked it in the eyes, and it looked back at me with an intelligence that was unmistakable and profound. That's not something you forget, and it's not something you can unsee. The forests here are old, deeper and more remote than most people realize. There are valleys that have never been logged, sections of wilderness where humans rarely venture. If something wanted to stay hidden in that vast expanse of mountains and trees, it could. It would just need to be smart enough, careful enough, and patient enough to avoid the increasingly rare places where its world overlaps with ours. And based on what I experienced, whatever lives up there in the high country has all 3 of those qualities in abundance. The CB radio is supposed to be for practical communication. Weather updates, traffic warnings, location of speed traps, that sort of thing. You get used to the voices, the handles drivers use, the casual way people share information that keeps everyone safe on the road. What you don't expect is to hear someone calling for help on a frequency that shouldn't have anyone on it, describing a location you're approaching, begging you to slow down because their brakes just failed. And you definitely don't expect to learn that the voice belongs to someone who died 15 years ago on the exact same stretch of highway you're currently driving. I was running westbound on I-84 through the Columbia River Gorge, hauling automotive parts from Boise to Portland on a foggy November night. The gorge is beautiful during the day, with the Columbia River on one side and sheer cliffs on the other, waterfalls cascading down rock faces, and forests that look like something out of a postcard. At night, especially in fog, it's a different story. The curves come faster than you remember, the drop-offs are invisible, but you know they're there, and the moisture makes everything slick. Around milepost 42, near where the Bonneville Dam exit comes up, my CB crackled to life with a transmission that made my blood run cold. The voice was panicked, breathless, speaking too fast. "Anyone eastbound near Bonneville, I need help. My brakes are gone. I'm doing 70 and I can't slow down. The grade's getting steeper and I can't stop. Somebody call for help. Please, I've got a wife and 2 kids." I grabbed my mic immediately. "Breaker, breaker, driver in distress near Bonneville. This is westbound at your 20. What's your handle and location?" Nothing. Just static. Then the voice came back, even more frantic. "The steering's getting harder. I think something's wrong with the hydraulics. I can't keep it in the lane. Oh God, I'm crossing the center line. I'm going into oncoming traffic." My heart was hammering. I was approaching milepost 42, scanning both lanes for a truck in trouble. The fog was thick enough that I could only see maybe 50 feet ahead, but there was no traffic around me. No eastbound trucks, no westbound traffic, except me. I keyed the mic again. "Driver, I'm right here. I don't see you. What's your exact location? Give me landmarks." The voice came back one more time, and this time I heard the screech of metal and the sound of something massive crashing. I hit the barrier. I'm going over. "Tell my wife I love her. Tell Sarah and Tommy their dad loves them. Tell them I'm..." And then nothing. Dead silence on the CB, except for the normal static and occasional chatter from other channels. I pulled over at the next safe spot, shaking so hard I could barely hold the steering wheel. I grabbed my phone and called 911, reported what I'd heard, gave them the approximate location. The dispatcher took my information, but said they had no reports of accidents. In that area, no calls for help, no indication of any truck in distress. She said she'd send a unit to check the area, but sounded skeptical, like I'd either imagined it or someone was playing a prank on the CB. I sat there for 20 minutes, waiting to see emergency vehicles pass, waiting for confirmation that someone needed help. Nothing. Just fog and the occasional vehicle passing on the highway. Finally, I got back on the road, telling myself it must have been some kind of interference, maybe a recording someone was broadcasting as a sick joke. But the terror in that voice had been real. You can't fake that kind of fear. I finished my delivery in Portland and stopped at a truck stop in Troutdale before heading back east. I needed coffee, and I needed to talk to someone about what I'd heard. The place was mostly empty at 4 in the morning, just a few drivers grabbing breakfast or fueling up. I sat at the counter next to an older driver, maybe in his late 60s, who had the weathered look of someone who'd been doing this job for decades. I mentioned hearing something strange on the CB near Bonneville, being deliberately vague to see if he'd react. He set down his coffee cup and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You heard Tommy, didn't you?" he said quietly. I felt the hair on my neck stand up. "Tommy?" He nodded. "Tommy Brewer. That was his handle on the CB. He died in 2010. Brake failure coming down the grade near milepost 42. Crossed the center line, hit the barrier, and went over the embankment. They found his truck at the bottom, burned out. He didn't make it." I stared at him, coffee forgotten. That's impossible. I just heard someone tonight, talking about brake failure at that exact location. Mentioned his wife and kids by name, Sarah and Tommy Jr. The old driver's face went pale. Those are Tommy's kids' names. His wife's name was Sarah, too. How do you know that? I told him everything I'd heard, every word of the transmission. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "You're not the first. Drivers have been reporting that transmission for years. Always in fog, always near milepost 42, always the same message. Some people think it's residual energy, like a recording playing over and over. Others think Tommy's trying to warn people about that section of road. It's dangerous there. The grade increases, there's a curve, and if your brakes are soft or you're going too fast, you can lose control exactly like he did." He pulled out his phone and showed me a news article from 2010. There was a photo of a man in his 30s, smiling at the camera, standing next to a Peterbilt. Thomas "Tommy" Brewer, killed in a single vehicle accident on I-84 near Bonneville Dam, survived by his wife Sarah and 2 children, ages 6 and 8. The article mentioned brake failure and how he'd crossed into oncoming traffic before hitting the median barrier and going over the side. Reading my own experience in that 15-year-old article made my hands shake. 3 weeks later, I was running the same route. Different load, different time of night, but the same stretch of I-84 through the gorge. It was foggy again, that thick Columbia River fog that turns the world into a gray void. As I approached milepost 42, I found myself tensing up, listening to the CB more carefully than usual. Part of me hoped I wouldn't hear anything. Part of me almost wanted to, just to confirm I hadn't imagined it the first time. The transmission came through at almost the exact same spot. Same voice, same panic, same desperate plea for help. But this time, I knew what I was hearing. "Anyone eastbound near Bonneville, I need help. My brakes are gone." I grabbed the mic, and instead of trying to locate him, I said something different. "Tommy, I hear you. I know what happened. I'm sorry. But you need to know. You're helping people. You're warning us about this section. You probably saved lives tonight." The transmission stopped mid-sentence. For a moment, there was just static. Then, very faintly, I heard something that might have been "thank you" before the channel went completely silent. I drove the rest of the gorge with tears running down my face, not entirely sure why I was crying. Maybe because I'd just had a conversation with a dead man. Maybe because the loneliness in that voice, even after 15 years, was something I understood. We spend our lives on these roads, isolated in our cabs, connected only by radio waves and the occasional conversation at truck stops. Maybe death doesn't change that. I started asking other drivers about it. Quietly, in conversations at rest stops and truck stops, careful not to sound crazy. More than a dozen drivers admitted they'd heard similar transmissions on that stretch of I-84. Always in fog, always near milepost 42. Always Tommy's voice describing his brake failure. But here's the thing that really got to me. 3 drivers told me they'd slowed down immediately after hearing the transmission, and within minutes encountered actual hazards. Black ice, debris in the road, a disabled vehicle with no lights. Things that could have caused serious accidents if they'd been going highway speed. One driver, a woman who'd been running the West Coast for 20 years, told me she'd heard Tommy's transmission and slowed down just in time to avoid a massive pileup ahead. This was during the big snowstorm in February 2025, the one that caused over 100 vehicles to crash near Multnomah Falls. She'd been approaching the area when she heard the brake failure warning, slowed to 40 miles per hour, and was able to stop in time when she came up on the carnage. She's convinced Tommy saved her life. I've heard him 4 more times since that first night. Always the same location, always in fog, always the same desperate message. I don't try to respond anymore. I just slow down and watch the road carefully, because I've learned that when Tommy broadcasts, there's usually a reason. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe drivers who hear his warning are just more cautious and therefore avoid accidents that were going to happen anyway. Or maybe there's something about that stretch of highway that keeps Tommy Brewer connected to it, trying to prevent other drivers from making his fatal mistake. I looked up his wife and kids. Sarah remarried in 2014. Tommy Jr. is 21 now. Sarah is 23. Neither of them drive trucks. According to social media, they both talk about their dad with love and respect, keeping his memory alive. They post on the anniversary of his death every year, sharing photos and memories. I wanted to message them, tell them what I've heard. But how do you tell someone their dead father is still out there trying to save lives? How do you explain that his last moments are replaying on CB radio for other drivers to hear? I decided not to contact them. Let them have their memories, their peace. But I think about Tommy every time I drive the gorge. I think about how he spent his last moments trying to get help. How terrified he must have been, knowing he couldn't stop and couldn't control where his truck was going. And I think about how, even in death, he's still trying to help other drivers, still broadcasting his warning, still trying to prevent what happened to him from happening to someone else. The CB radio is for practical communication, weather updates, traffic warnings, location of speed traps. But sometimes, if conditions are right and you're in the right place at the right time, it's something more. It's a connection between the living and the dead. A warning from someone who knows exactly how dangerous that curve can be, how fast things can go wrong, how precious those last seconds are before everything goes black. Tommy Brewer never made it home that night in 2010. But he's still out there on I-84, still trying to make sure other drivers do. There are certain loads you don't question. When a dispatcher gives you a pickup location, a delivery address, and tells you the trailer's already sealed and ready to go, you hook up and drive. That's the job. You're not responsible for what's inside, just for getting it where it needs to be on time and in the same condition it was when you picked it up. That policy exists for a reason, and for 26 years I followed it without issue. Until I picked up trailer number RT47A2 from a meat processing facility off Highway 97 just south of Klamath Falls, and learned that some rules exist because breaking them can save your life. The pickup was routine. Pre-dawn in late March, the kind of cold morning where your breath hangs in the air and frost covers everything. The facility was one of those industrial operations you see scattered along 97, processing beef for distribution across the West Coast. I'd hauled from them before without incident. The dispatcher had called it a hot load, meaning I needed to get it to Sacramento within 12 hours to meet a delivery window. Frozen beef in a refrigerated trailer, temperature locked at -10 degrees, sealed and certified by USDA inspectors. Everything by the book. The trailer was sitting in the yard when I arrived. A standard 53-foot refrigerated unit with the refrigeration system already running. I could hear the diesel generator humming, see the exhaust vapor rising in the cold air. The dock supervisor handed me the paperwork. Bills of lading showing 40,000 pounds of frozen beef quarters, sealed and inspected at 11 p.m. the previous night. The seal number matched the paperwork. The temperature gauge on the outside of the trailer read -12 degrees. Everything looked legitimate. I did my pre-trip inspection, checked the trailer lights and brakes, made sure the refrigeration system was running properly. The supervisor watched me work, which wasn't unusual, but there was something about his expression I couldn't read. When I asked if there were any issues with the load, he just shook his head and said to get it delivered quickly. Said the customer was particular about temperature consistency. Again, nothing unusual. Frozen meat is time-sensitive, temperature-sensitive, and expensive. You don't mess around with refrigerated loads. I hooked up the trailer, did my air brake test, and pulled out of the facility at 5:30 a.m. The plan was to take 97 south to I-5, then straight shot to Sacramento. 9 hours of driving if I pushed it, which would get the load there with time to spare. I grabbed coffee at the truck stop just south of Klamath Falls and headed out, watching the sunrise paint the Cascade Mountains gold and orange. Just another day, another load, another paycheck. The first indication something was wrong came about an hour into the drive. I was cruising through open country south of Klamath Falls when I felt something through the cab. Not a sound, exactly. More like a vibration. A rhythmic thump that seemed to come from behind me. I checked my mirrors, thinking maybe I'd thrown a retread or had a tire issue, but everything looked normal. The thumping continued, irregular but persistent, like something was shifting inside the trailer. I pulled over at the next wide spot and got out to check. The trailer looked fine. The refrigeration unit was running smoothly, the exhaust steady, the temperature gauge showing minus 11 degrees. But when I put my hand on the trailer wall, I felt it. A definite vibration, something moving inside. Cargo shift, I told myself. Frozen beef quarters hanging from rails, swaying with the movement of the truck. Except frozen meat doesn't shift. It's solid, locked in place by its own weight and the freezing temperature. I checked the seal on the trailer doors. Intact, unbroken, the number matching my paperwork exactly. Opening the trailer would break the seal, and breaking the seal meant I'd be liable for any discrepancies in the load when it was delivered. Company policy was clear. Don't break the seal unless there's visible damage or safety concerns. A little cargo movement didn't qualify. So I got back in the cab and continued driving, telling myself it was nothing. The thumping got louder over the next hour. Not constant, but regular enough that I couldn't ignore it. Thump, pause, thump, thump, pause. Like something was hitting the inside of the trailer wall, like something was trying to get out. I turned up the radio to drown it out, but I could still feel it through the seat, through the steering wheel, a rhythmic pounding that made my chest tight and my hands sweat. Then the temperature gauge started climbing. Minus 11 became minus 9, then minus 7, then minus 4. The refrigeration unit was running. I could hear it laboring, working harder than it should need to. But the temperature inside the trailer kept rising despite the system running at full capacity. At 30 degrees, frozen meat starts to thaw. At 40 degrees, bacteria begins to multiply. At 50 degrees, you've got a health hazard and a total loss of the load. I pulled over again, this time at a rest stop about 40 miles south of Klamath Falls. The temperature gauge now read 2 degrees, above freezing, completely unacceptable for frozen cargo. I had to check the load, seal or no seal. If the refrigeration system had failed, I needed to document it immediately to avoid liability. I grabbed my phone to start recording, walked back to the trailer doors, and felt my blood run cold. The metal was warm, not cold like it should be with a working refrigeration system. Warm, like something inside was generating heat. And the thumping was loud now, clear and distinct. Something was moving in there, something large enough to shake a 53-foot trailer. I put my ear against the door and heard something that made my stomach turn. Breathing. Heavy, labored breathing, like an animal in distress. My hands were shaking as I reached for the seal. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, to call my dispatcher, to call the police, to do anything except open that trailer. But if there was an animal trapped inside, if someone had accidentally sealed a worker inside the trailer, if there was any chance someone needed help, I had to check. I broke the seal, threw the locking bars, and pulled the right door open a few inches. The smell hit me first. Not the clean, cold smell of frozen meat. Something else, warm and organic and wrong. The interior of the trailer was dark, the small amount of light from outside showing only the first few feet. I could see the beef quarters hanging from their rails, but they were dripping. Thawed meat doesn't drip like that, doesn't move like that, doesn't smell like that. And then I saw the claw marks. Deep gouges in the inside of the trailer walls, 4 parallel lines that had torn through the insulated aluminum like it was paper. The gouges were fresh, the metal still bright where it had been ripped. Something had done that from the inside. Something with claws strong enough to shred industrial refrigeration panels. I swung the door wider, my phone light illuminating more of the interior, and saw that the entire inside was covered with those marks. The walls, the ceiling, even the beef quarters themselves, torn and shredded. Something moved in the darkness at the back of the trailer. Something large. I slammed the door and ran back to my cab, my heart trying to punch through my ribcage. I locked the doors, grabbed my CB radio, and called for help. Police, animal control, anyone. The dispatcher on the other end asked me to repeat myself, said I wasn't making sense. I tried to explain there was something alive in my trailer, something that shouldn't be there, something that had torn through frozen meat and metal. While I was on the radio, the thumping intensified. The entire trailer was rocking now, like something inside was throwing itself against the walls. I started the engine, ready to unhook and leave the trailer there, when I heard the sound that still wakes me up at night. Metal tearing, the sound of claws ripping through aluminum from the inside. I looked in my mirror and saw the side of the trailer bulging outward, the metal stretching, beginning to split. I didn't wait to see what came out. I released the trailer brakes, pulled the 5th wheel release, and drove away from that trailer faster than I've ever driven in my life. In my mirror, I saw the trailer rocking violently, saw the metal split open along one side. I didn't stop to see what emerged. I just drove until I reached a town, pulled into the first police station I found, and reported everything. The police were skeptical until they pulled up the security footage from the rest stop. It showed my truck arriving, showed me opening the trailer, showed me running back to my cab. And it showed something coming out of that trailer after I left. Something the officers wouldn't describe in detail, just said it was unidentified, and that they'd called in state wildlife officers and federal authorities. They impounded my truck, questioned me for 6 hours, and finally released me with instructions not to discuss what I'd seen. Here's where it gets stranger. When my company tried to file an insurance claim for the lost load and damaged trailer, they discovered the trailer number RT4782 didn't exist in any database. Not in the federal DOT system, not in the refrigeration unit manufacturer's records, not in any rental or leasing company database. The paperwork I had was legitimate, but the trailer itself had no history. No registration, no maintenance records, no proof it had ever been manufactured. The meat processing facility in Klamath Falls denied ever loading that trailer. Their records showed no outbound shipments on the night in question. The dock supervisor I'd talked to wasn't employed there and couldn't be located. The seal number on my paperwork didn't match any seal in their inventory. It was like the entire pickup had never happened, except for the fact that I had a trailer that was very real until something tore its way out. I never found out what was in that trailer. The federal authorities took over the investigation and refused to share information. The rest stop where I'd abandoned the trailer was closed for 3 days, while teams in hazmat suits cleaned the area. Local news reported a chemical spill, but the drivers I talked to who were there said they saw cages and heavy restraints being loaded into unmarked vehicles. I don't haul refrigerated loads anymore. Can't do it. Every time I see a reefer trailer, I remember that sound. The breathing, the claws on metal, the warmth coming from something that should have been frozen solid. I remember the claw marks and the way the meat was shredded and the knowledge that something was in there that shouldn't exist, shouldn't be possible. Sometimes late at night, I think about what I didn't see. What came out of that trailer after I drove away. What had been sealed inside and transported to God knows where for God knows what purpose. And I think about all the other pre-sealed trailers out there, moving across the highways, their contents unknown and unquestioned. How many of them contain exactly what the paperwork says? And how many of them contain something else? Something that's alive when it shouldn't be. Something with claws. Something that's breathing in the darkness, waiting for someone to break that seal and open the door. There are things in this world that make you feel small in a way that goes beyond physical size. Standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon does it. Looking up at a sky full of stars on a moonless night does it. And driving Route 1001 along the Oregon coast at 3 in the morning when the fog rolls in from the Pacific does it. That feeling of being insignificant, of being utterly alone in the face of something vast and indifferent. I've felt it dozens of times on that stretch of highway. But only once did I feel something else mixed in with that smallness. Something that made every primitive instinct in my body scream at me to run, to hide, to get as far away as possible from whatever was moving in that fog. I was hauling produce from the farms around Salem down to distributors in southern Oregon, running the coast route because the weather report said Highway 5 was backed up with construction. Route 101 along the coast is longer but scenic, and I didn't mind the extra time. The pay was the same regardless of which route I took, and watching the sun set over the Pacific Ocean beats staring at endless farmland any day. I'd made this run maybe 30 times before. Knew every curve and turnoff, knew where the good coffee was and which rest stops had the cleanest bathrooms. The fog started around Cannon Beach, which wasn't unusual for that time of year. October on the Oregon coast means fog, sometimes so thick you can barely see the center line of the highway. It rolls in off the ocean in banks that look solid enough to touch, reducing visibility to almost nothing and making the world feel like it's shrinking down to just you and 20 feet of wet pavement. I'd driven through plenty of fog before. This felt different from the start. It was too dense. Fog usually has some variation to it. Some places where it's thinner and you can see a little further. Some places where it thickens up but then clears again. This was like driving into a wall. One moment I could see the ocean on my left and the forested hills on my right. The next moment I was completely blind, except for my own headlights reflecting back at me from the white void ahead. I slowed down to maybe 30 miles per hour, which felt too fast, but stopping wasn't an option. There was nowhere to pull over safely, and sitting still on a highway in zero visibility is asking to get rear-ended. The temperature inside my cab dropped suddenly, at least 10 degrees in the span of maybe 20 seconds. I could see my breath condensing in the air, which didn't make sense because my heater was running full blast. The windows started fogging up on the inside, and when I reached out to wipe the windshield clear, the glass was ice cold. Not just cool from the outside air, but genuinely cold, like I'd touched metal that had been sitting in a freezer. That's when I felt the first vibration. It came up through the wheels, through the frame of the truck, through my seat and into my spine. A deep, subsonic rumble that I felt more than heard, like distant thunder. Except it didn't fade. It just kept going, steady and rhythmic, matching something that might have been breathing if breathing could shake 18 wheels and 40 tons of truck and cargo. I checked my mirrors instinctively, thinking maybe there was another truck behind me, something massive that I somehow hadn't noticed. But the mirrors showed nothing except white fog and the faint glow of my own tail lights. The vibration continued, and now I could hear something too. A sound like wind, but deeper, more resonant. Like the sound a whale makes, those deep calls that travel for miles through the ocean. Except this wasn't coming from the ocean. It was coming from the fog itself. Something moved on my left, between my truck and where I knew the ocean had to be. I couldn't see it clearly, just a darkness in the fog, a shadow that was somehow blacker than the surrounding white. But the scale of it made my breath catch in my throat. It was huge, not truck huge, not even building huge. It was massive in a way that defied reasonable estimation. A shape that suggested something the size of a cargo ship moving parallel to the highway just off the shoulder of the road. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the fog, shadows and light playing games with my perception. But the vibration was stronger now, rhythmic and deliberate, and I realized with growing horror that I was feeling footsteps. Something was walking beside my truck, keeping pace with me, its footfalls heavy enough to shake the ground and transmit the impact through my tires and suspension. Each step sent a pulse through the frame of my truck that I could feel in my chest, in my teeth, in the base of my skull. The fog swirled, and I caught another glimpse of the shape. An outline, vague and indistinct, but definitely there. It was upright, bipedal maybe, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too broad, limbs that seemed too long and moved in ways that didn't match any animal I'd ever seen. And then I saw what might have been an eye. A pale luminescence in the darkness, reflecting my headlights the way an animal's eyes reflect light, but enormous. The size of a dinner plate, maybe larger, positioned at least 30 feet off the ground. I did what any rational person would do. I accelerated. Not much, because visibility was still almost zero and I wasn't suicidal. But I pushed my speed up to 45, then 50, trying to outrun whatever was out there in the fog. The vibration intensified, the footsteps coming faster, and I realized with sick certainty that it was matching my speed. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed down slightly to navigate a curve, it slowed down. It was pacing me, staying parallel to my truck like it was curious, like it was studying me. The breathing sound got louder. I'm calling it breathing because I don't know what else to call it. But it was like nothing I'd ever heard. Deep and slow and wet, like air moving through something massive and organic. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the fog itself. And each exhalation made the temperature drop another degree. My windows were frosting over now, actual ice forming on the inside of the glass, which shouldn't be possible. The defrost was running full blast, but couldn't keep up with whatever was stealing the heat from inside my cab. I grabbed my CB radio with shaking hands and keyed the mic. Breaker, breaker. Anyone on a 101 near Cannon Beach, do you copy? Static. I tried again, running through different channels. Nothing. No response, no background chatter, no indication that anyone else existed in the world except me and whatever was out there in the fog. My phone showed no service, which wasn't unusual for this stretch of coast. But the timing felt deliberately cruel. The shape moved closer. I couldn't see details, couldn't make out any features through the fog, but I could sense its proximity. It was right there, maybe 20 feet from my driver's side window, massive and impossible and utterly alien. I had the overwhelming impression that it was aware of me, that it knew I was inside this metal box, that it was considering whether I was worth its attention. The feeling of being observed, of being evaluated by an intelligence that was nothing like human intelligence, was more terrifying than any physical threat could have been. Then it made a sound that I still can't adequately describe. Imagine a foghorn, but organic. Imagine whale song mixed with the rumble of an earthquake. Imagine a sound so deep that you feel it in your internal organs, that makes your vision blur and your inner ear rebel and your heart skip beats. That sound filled the world, vibrated through the fog, through my truck, through my body, and for a moment I thought I was going to pass out just from the sheer physical impact of it. I don't remember the next few minutes clearly. I know I kept driving. No, I kept the truck on the road somehow, despite shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel. The shape stayed with me, moving through the fog with a fluid grace that something that size shouldn't possess. Sometimes it was close enough that I could feel the displacement of air when it moved. Other times it fell back slightly, and I'd think maybe it had lost interest, maybe it was leaving. Then the footsteps would return, the breathing would resume, and I'd know it was still there. Mile marker 62. I remember seeing that sign through a brief gap in the fog, and I remember thinking I'd been driving in this nightmare for at least 20 minutes. My hands were numb from gripping the wheel, my shoulders ached from tension, and I was crying without realizing it. Tears running down my face while I muttered prayers I'd learned as a child and hadn't said in 30 years. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it ended. One moment I was driving blind through suffocating fog with something massive stalking me from the shoulder. The next moment the fog was just gone, not gradually thinning, not slowly dissipating. It was like driving through a curtain. One side was the fog and whatever lived in it. The other side was clear night air with stars visible overhead, and the highway stretching out ahead of me, empty and normal. I looked in my mirrors and saw the fog behind me, a solid wall of white that ended at a specific point on the highway, like someone had drawn a line. The fog didn't move past that point. It just sat there, thick and impenetrable, and I swear I could see something massive moving inside it. A shadow darker than the surrounding white, pacing back and forth along that invisible boundary, like it couldn't or wouldn't cross. I drove for another 10 miles before I felt safe enough to pull over at a rest stop. I sat there with all my lights on, engine running, doors locked, and tried to make sense of what had happened. My rational mind kept insisting it was just fog, just tricks of light and shadow and my imagination running wild. But my body knew better. I was soaked with sweat despite the cold, my heart was still racing, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I went into the rest stop to use the bathroom and splash water on my face, and found an older man, probably in his 70s, standing at the sink. He took one look at me and said, "You came through the fog." Not a question, a statement. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He nodded back. "Native folks around here have stories about that stretch of coast. They say when the fog rolls in like that, thick and solid, it brings something with it. Something old. Older than the trees, older than the mountains. They call it different names in different languages, but the meaning is the same. The thing that walks in the fog." He told me about Amhuluk, a creature from Kalapuya legends associated with fog and water and drowning. About fog walkers that Native American tribes warned about for centuries before white settlers arrived. about other drivers who'd reported similar experiences, seeing massive shapes in the fog along that exact stretch of coastline, feeling footsteps that shook their trucks, hearing sounds that seemed to come from something too large to exist on land. I asked him if he believed the stories. He gave me a look that was equal parts pity and understanding. Doesn't matter what I believe. Matters what you know now. You've seen it, felt it. That changes a person. He was right. I knew what I'd experienced. I'd felt something massive moving in that fog, something that made my truck feel like a toy, that made me feel like an insect under observation. I finished my delivery that morning and took Highway 5 back north. Longer route, more traffic. But I didn't care. I haven't driven 101 past Cannon Beach at night since then, especially not when the weather forecast mentions fog. Other drivers have told me I'm being superstitious, that let my imagination get the better of me. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was all just unusual fog conditions and my tired brain conjuring monsters. But I know what I felt. I know what I heard. And I know that somewhere off the Oregon coast, when the fog rolls in thick and cold and unnatural, something moves within it. Something massive and ancient and utterly indifferent to human understanding. The coastal Native Americans knew about it long before we built highways through their territory. They knew enough to respect it, to avoid it, to understand that some things exist whether we choose to believe in them or not. The fog still rolls in along that coast, thick and white and impenetrable. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough to be driving through it at the wrong time, you'll feel the vibrations. You'll hear the breathing. You'll see the shadow darker than the fog itself. And you'll know that you're not alone out there. That you're sharing that stretch of highway with something that was here long before roads existed, and will be here long after they've crumbled away. The only question is whether it will decide you're worth its attention. I hope you never have to find out. Loneliness is the default state for long-haul truckers. You get used to it. The hours and hours alone in your cab, with nothing but highway and your own thoughts. That's why when you find a convoy, when you fall in with other trucks heading the same direction and everyone's chatting on the CB, it feels good. It feels like community. Like you're part of something larger than just one person hauling freight across empty miles. That's what I thought when I joined the convoy on I-5 through Siskiyou Pass on that clear October night. 7 trucks running together, voices friendly on the radio, everyone watching out for each other. It felt good right up until the moment I realized none of them should have been there. I was southbound from Portland to Sacramento, hauling electronics through some of the most dangerous highway in the Pacific Northwest. Siskiyou Pass sits at over 4,000 feet elevation on the California-Oregon border, with grades steep enough to burn out brakes and curves sharp enough to flip a truck if you take them too fast. More than half the accidents on that stretch involve commercial trucks. I'd made the run dozens of times, and I always approached the pass with respect and caution. It was just past midnight when I started the climb toward the summit. Traffic was light, which was normal for that time of night in late October. I had my CB tuned to Channel 19, the trucker channel, listening to occasional chatter from other drivers scattered across the interstate. That's when I heard the call. Any southbound trucks approaching Siskiyou? We got a convoy forming up at milepost 46 if you want to join. Running steady at 60, looking out for bears and road conditions. I keyed my mic. This is southbound at milepost 42. I'll catch up to you boys in a few minutes. What's your handle? The response came back friendly and relaxed. This is Roadrunner. We got 6 trucks already, one more makes 7. Lucky number. Come on back when you catch up. I felt that familiar warmth of finding company on a lonely stretch of road. Running in a convoy meant shared information, someone to talk to, and the safety of numbers if anything went wrong. I caught up to them just south of the summit, and the sight of all those trucks running together, their lights stretching out down the highway, made me smile. I pulled into position at the back of the line and keyed my mic. This is the new guy, handles Mountain Man. Appreciate you letting me join. The responses came back from different voices, each introducing themselves. Roadrunner, Steel Horse, Night Owl, Big Bear, Diesel Dave, and Rolling Thunder. Standard trucker handles, friendly tones, nothing unusual. We ran like that for maybe 20 minutes, everyone maintaining speed and spacing, occasional chatter on the CB about weather and road conditions ahead. That's when I started noticing things that felt slightly off. Small things at first. Night Owl mentioned checking in at a way station that I knew had been closed for renovations for the past 6 months. Steel Horse talked about fuel prices at a truck stop that had burned down 3 years ago and been replaced with a different chain. Little inconsistencies that I told myself I was misremembering. Then Big Bear made a reference to the new president and said something about policies I didn't recognize. When I asked what he meant, there was a pause on the radio before someone else changed the subject. The conversation continued, but now I was listening more carefully, and the wrongness became harder to ignore. They were using CB codes I hadn't heard in years, terminology that felt outdated. 10 codes that had been replaced by clearer language years ago for safety reasons. I started paying more attention to the trucks themselves. The one directly in front of me was a Peterbilt, but the model looked wrong somehow. The taillights were configured differently than current models, and the proportions seemed slightly off, like seeing a familiar face that's been subtly altered. In the distance, I could see the other trucks in the convoy, and they all had that same quality. Recognizable but wrong, like looking at vehicles through slightly distorted glass. The conversation on the CB got stranger. Roadrunner mentioned making a delivery to a company I knew had gone out of business in 2015. Diesel Dave talked about his wife waiting for him at home, then mentioned a street address in a town I'd driven through last week, where that entire street had been demolished for a new bypass. Rolling Thunder complained about new regulations that I'd never heard of, rules that didn't match any current DOT requirements. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were talking about old times, sharing memories. Maybe I was misunderstanding references. But there was something about the way they spoke, the casual, present-tense way they discussed things that didn't exist anymore, that made my skin crawl. And when I really focused on listening, their voices had a quality I couldn't quite identify. Not quite echo, not quite static, but something that made them sound like they were coming from further away than just a few hundred feet. I checked my CB radio settings, making sure I was on the right channel. Channel 19, clear signal, everything normal. But the feeling of wrongness kept growing. I found myself watching the trucks ahead more carefully, and I realized something that made my hands tighten on the wheel. They were maintaining perfect spacing. Not the slight variations you'd expect from different drivers adjusting their speed, but exact, precise distances between each truck. Like they were linked together, like they were one entity instead of 7 individual vehicles. Steel Horse started telling a story about a close call he'd had last week on a stretch of highway that was currently under construction and had been for the past year. He described landmarks and exits that had been changed or removed. Night Owl chimed in with his own version of the same story, mentioning details that matched too perfectly, like they were reciting from a script. The The conversation had a rehearsed quality now that I was listening for it. I decided to test something. I keyed my mic and asked a specific question. "Hey, Roadrunner, you ever stop at the Flying J in Weed, the new one they built last year?" There was a long pause, longer than a simple question should generate. Then Roadrunner's voice came back, but it sounded different, flatter. "Yeah, we stop there all the time. Good coffee." But there was no Flying J in Weed. I'd made that up, and he'd answered like it was real. The convoy started taking an exit, all 7 trucks moving in synchronized precision. The CB crackled with Roadrunner's voice. "We're pulling off for fuel. You coming with us, Mountain Man?" I looked at the exit number as we approached. Exit 38. But according to my GPS and my memory of this route, there was no exit 38 on this stretch of I-5. The exits jumped from 40 to 36, with nothing in between. Yet there it was, an off-ramp with a sign showing exit 38, and all 6 trucks ahead of me were taking it. I stayed on the highway. Something primal in my brain was screaming at me not to follow them, not to take that exit that shouldn't exist. In my mirror, I watched the trucks disappear down the ramp one by one, their lights vanishing into darkness. The CB went silent immediately. No final goodbyes. No acknowledgement that I'd chosen not to follow. Just empty static on Channel 19 like those voices had never existed. I drove for another 10 miles in complete silence, my heart pounding before I pulled into a legitimate rest area. I needed to process what had just happened. Needed to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. There were a few other trucks parked there, and I walked over to one where the driver was doing a pre-trip inspection. Older guy, maybe in his 60s, with the weathered look of someone who'd been driving for decades. I asked him if he'd seen a convoy of 7 trucks pass through. He looked at me strangely and said I was the first southbound truck he'd seen in the past 30 minutes. Said it had been unusually quiet on the highway tonight. I insisted, described the trucks, mentioned the handles they'd used on the CB. His expression changed from confusion to something that looked like recognition mixed with concern. "Son, when did you see these trucks?" I told him. Gave him the timeline, explained about joining the convoy. He was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out his phone and showed me a news article from 2008. A convoy of 7 trucks had crashed on Siskiyou Pass during a winter storm. All 7 drivers killed when they lost control on the descent and went off the embankment. The article listed their names and handles: Roadrunner, Steel Horse, Night Owl, Big Bear, Diesel, Dave, Rolling Thunder, and one more I hadn't mentioned, one I'd somehow forgotten hearing on the CB: Shadow Rider. I pulled up my own phone and started checking. Every inconsistency I'd noticed, every outdated reference, every wrong detail matched the world as it existed in 2008. The regulations they'd mentioned, the companies they'd talked about making deliveries to, the truck models I'd seen, all of them consistent with 2008, not 2025. I'd been running with trucks that existed 17 years ago, driven by men who'd been dead for 17 years. The driver told me other truckers had reported similar experiences over the years. Seeing a convoy on Siskiyou Pass late at night, running with them for a while, then realizing something was wrong. Some drivers said they'd followed the convoy off the highway and found themselves on roads that didn't exist. Others, like me, had the sense to stay on the interstate and watch the ghost convoy disappear. I got back in my truck and pulled up my dash cam footage, which records continuously and stores the last 48 hours. I scrolled back to the time when I'd been running with the convoy. The video showed my truck driving alone down I-5, No trucks ahead of me, no convoy, no exit 38. Just my truck, solitary on an empty highway, with my voice on the CB talking to no one, having one-sided conversations with static. But here's what made me question everything. My CB radio's recording function, which I keep running to document traffic conditions and road issues, had captured the conversations. All of them. Every voice, every code, every outdated reference. The audio was there, clear and distinct, proving I hadn't imagined it. The cameras showed I was alone. The audio proved I wasn't. Two pieces of evidence that contradicted each other, leaving me with no idea which one represented reality. I finished my delivery in Sacramento and drove back north 2 days later. When I approached Siskiyou Pass, I watched for exit 38. It wasn't there. Just the normal exits, properly numbered and documented. But on my CB radio, as I crested the summit at 2 in the morning, I heard a familiar voice. Any southbound trucks approaching Siskiyou, we got a convoy forming up if you want to join. Roadrunner's voice, friendly and inviting, calling for trucks to join a convoy that died in 2008. I didn't respond. I drove the pass alone, watching my mirrors, half expecting to see 7 sets of headlights appear behind me. They didn't. But I heard them on the CB for the next 30 miles, having conversations about a world that doesn't exist anymore, making plans to stop at truck stops that have been demolished, discussing regulations that have been replaced, living out their last run over and over again. The truck stop I finally pulled into had security cameras covering the lot. I asked the manager if I could review the footage from when I'd driven past with the convoy weeks earlier. He pulled it up and showed me the timestamp. My truck, driving alone, no convoy. But in the audio from my CB, I could still hear their voices, could still hear myself responding to them, could still hear the sound of 7 trucks running together through the night. I don't know what I encountered on Siskiyou Pass. A temporal echo, maybe. Some kind of recording in the fabric of the highway itself that replays under certain conditions. Or maybe those 7 drivers are still out there, still running their routes, unaware that they died 17 years ago, existing in a parallel version of the highway that overlaps with ours just enough for the living to glimpse the dead. What I know is this. The convoy is still out there, still calling for trucks to join them on Channel 19, still running the pass at night, maintaining perfect spacing, having conversations about a world that's been gone for nearly 2 decades. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough to be on that highway at the right time, you'll hear Roadrunner's voice inviting you to join. Your cameras will show you're alone. Your radio will prove you're not. And you'll have to decide which version of reality you want to believe. I chose to believe the cameras. But late at night, when I'm running through Siskiyou Pass and my CB crackles to life with that familiar invitation, part of me wonders, what would have happened if I'd taken exit 38? Would I have found those 7 drivers still alive in their version of 2008, forever running their final route? Would I have become the 8th truck in a convoy that exists outside of time, trapped on an endless loop through a highway that connects not just places, but different versions of reality? I'll never know, because I'm not brave enough or foolish enough to find out. The living should stay with the living, and the dead should be left to their eternal roots. Even if sometimes the line between the two gets blurred on a lonely stretch of highway at 2 in the morning, when 7 trucks that shouldn't exist call out on the CB, looking for one more driver to complete their convoy. There are things you can lose and get back. Your keys, your wallet, your temper. But when you lose time, when a piece of your life is just gone, and you have no memory of where it went, That's different. That's a violation that goes deeper than theft. It's like someone reached into your head and erased part of who you are. I know because it happened to me on Highway 26 through Mount Hood on a Tuesday night in April. And I still have the evidence to prove it. Evidence I can't explain, and that terrifies me more than any ghost story or highway legend ever could. I was hauling refrigerated food from Portland to Prineville, a routine run I'd made maybe twice a month for the past 3 years. Highway 26 through Mount Hood is a good road. Scenic during the day with views of the mountain, straightforward at night with moderate traffic and decent visibility. I'd left Portland around 9 p.m., planning to arrive in Prineville around 1 in the morning with time to spare before my delivery window opened at 6. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. Until it wasn't. The last clear memory I have is approaching the Edwards Tunnel around milepost 40. I remember seeing the tunnel entrance. Remember my headlights illuminating the concrete walls as I entered. The tunnel isn't long, maybe a quarter mile. One of those mountain tunnels that cuts through a ridge to avoid a steeper grade. I remember entering it. I don't remember leaving it. My next memory is being parked in a clearing about 2 miles past the tunnel. Not on the shoulder of the highway, but actually off the road down a dirt access road I didn't remember turning onto. My truck was idling, headlights pointing at a stand of pine trees, and I was sitting in my seat with my hands on the steering wheel like I'd been driving. But I had absolutely no memory of how I got there or why I'd stopped. I looked at my clock. It read 11:53 p.m. I'd entered the tunnel just before 10:30. An hour and 20 minutes were just gone. Vanished. No memory of driving, no memory of exiting the tunnel, no memory of turning off the highway or parking. Just a blank space where that time should have been. My heart started racing and my hands were shaking as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I checked my GPS. It showed me 2 miles east of the tunnel, which matched where I appeared to be. But the route history was strange. It showed my truck had been stationary for exactly 62 minutes. Not moving, not idling along slowly. Completely stopped in this clearing for over an hour. But I had no memory of stopping. No memory of why I would have pulled off the highway onto what looked like a Forest Service access road. My phone was sitting in the cup holder where I always kept it while driving. When I picked it up, I felt my stomach drop. There were 47 photos in my camera roll that I didn't remember taking. I scrolled through them with mounting horror. They were all taken. From inside my cab, all within the past hour according to the timestamps. Pictures of the clearing outside my truck. Pictures of my dashboard. Pictures of the steering wheel. And pictures of the sky. The sky photos showed something I couldn't identify. Lights, but not like aircraft lights or stars. These were different, bright and moving in formations that didn't follow any pattern I recognized. Some photos showed them hovering. Others showed them in motion, creating streaks of light across the frame. I had taken 47 photos documenting something in the sky above this clearing, and I had absolutely no memory of doing it. I got out of my truck on shaking legs and looked around the clearing. It was maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by dense forest, with the access road leading back to the highway. The ground was covered in pine needles and patches of snow that hadn't melted yet. That's when I saw the footprints. My boots, clearly identifiable by their tread pattern, walking in circles around my truck. Not random circles, but precise, measured circuits like I'd been pacing. The prints showed I'd circled my truck at least a dozen times. I bent down to examine them and noticed something else that made my blood run cold. The prints were in snow that was undisturbed except for my footprints. No animal tracks, No tire tracks from other vehicles, nothing. Just my boots, walking circles around my truck in a clearing I didn't remember entering. And next to one of the footprints, pressed into the snow, was a handprint. My hand, palm down, fingers spread, like I'd fallen or knelt down and caught myself. But I had no memory of that either. I went back to my truck and checked my tachograph, the device that records every detail of a commercial vehicle's operation. Hours driven, speeds, when the vehicle was in motion, when it was stopped. The data was there, precise and undeniable. At 10:31 p.m., my truck had stopped. It had remained stationary for 62 minutes. At 11:33 p.m., it had started moving again, driving exactly 1.8 miles before stopping at my current location. The tachograph doesn't lie. It's a legal document, admissible in court. According to that record, I had driven for an hour, stopped, then driven again. But I remembered none of it. My dash cam. I had a dash cam that recorded continuously, storing footage on a loop. I pulled up the footage with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The video showed me entering the tunnel at 10:29 p.m. The camera captured my truck driving through the tunnel, emerging on the other side, continuing down the highway. Then, at 10:31 p.m., my truck turned onto an access road without signaling, without slowing down first. Just a smooth, precise turn like I'd been planning it. The footage showed my truck driving down that access road and parking in the clearing exactly where I'd woken up. The camera faced forward, showing the trees and the night sky above them. For 62 minutes, the camera recorded my truck sitting still. But at several points during that hour, the video showed those lights I'd photographed. Bright, moving in impossible patterns, descending until they were just above the tree line before ascending again. The most disturbing part of the footage was a shadow on the hood of my truck at 11:17 p.m. A shadow that moved, that appeared to be a person standing in front of the truck, silhouetted against those strange lights. The shadow was my height, my build. It was me, standing in front of my truck, looking up at something in the sky. I watched myself stand there for nearly 10 minutes before the shadow moved out of frame. I had no memory of leaving my cab, no memory of standing in that clearing, no memory of any of it. I needed to get out of there. I needed to get back on the highway, complete my delivery, and process what had happened. I put the truck in gear and followed the access road back to Highway 26. The drive to Prineville felt endless, every shadow making me jump, every light in my mirrors making my heart race. I kept checking my clock, terrified that more time would disappear, that I'd blink and find myself somewhere else with no memory of how I got there. I made my delivery in Prineville at 2:45 a.m., later than planned, but still before the delivery window. The warehouse supervisor noticed I looked shaken and asked if I was okay. I told him I was tired, that it had been a long night. What else could I say? That I'd lost an hour of my life and had photos and video I couldn't explain. That I'd apparently stood outside my truck photographing strange lights in the sky and had no memory of doing it. I drove to a truck stop and parked in the most well-lit spot I could find, surrounded by other trucks and people. I sat there reviewing the evidence over and over. The photos, the video, the tachograph data, the GPS history. All of it consistent, all of it proving I'd been parked in that clearing for over an hour. All of it showing me doing things I couldn't remember. The disconnect between the objective evidence and my complete lack of memory was maddening. That's when I noticed it. A small metallic object embedded in my steering wheel. Not on the surface, actually embedded in the hard plastic, like it had been pressed in while the plastic was soft. I tried to pull it out, but it wouldn't budge. It was fused to the steering wheel somehow, a smooth metallic disc about the size of a quarter, darker than chrome, with a surface that seemed to shift when I looked at it directly. I took my truck to a mechanic the next day, showed him the object, asked if he could remove it or at least identify what it was. He examined it with several tools, tried to pry it loose, finally gave up, and said he'd never seen anything like it. The metal wasn't aluminum, wasn't steel, wasn't any alloy he recognized. And there was no way it should have been able to embed itself in hard plastic without melting or cracking the steering wheel. The plastic around it showed no signs of heat damage or stress. It was like the object had phased through solid matter and then solidified. I started researching missing time experiences. Found hundreds of accounts from people who'd lost hours of their lives with no memory of where the time went. Many of them associated with UFO sightings in the Pacific Northwest, particularly around Mount Hood and the surrounding areas. The pattern was consistent. People would be driving, would experience a period of missing time, and would later find evidence that they'd been somewhere or done something they couldn't remember. Some of them reported finding marks on their bodies, strange scars or bruises they couldn't explain. Others reported electronic equipment malfunctioning or showing strange behavior after the incident. A few mentioned finding objects or marks on their vehicles that shouldn't be there. Reading their accounts felt like reading my own experience through different eyes. The same confusion, the same violation, the same evidence that something had happened that their conscious minds couldn't access. I had the photos analyzed by someone who knew about image forensics. They confirmed the photos were taken by my phone at the times indicated by the metadata from the location shown. They weren't manipulated or edited. Whatever those lights were, they were real enough to be captured by a camera phone. But that didn't tell me what they were or why I had photographed them. The hardest part isn't the missing time itself. It's knowing that something happened to me. Something significant enough that I took 47 photos and stood outside my truck for 10 minutes in a remote clearing at night. It's knowing that my body was moving, my phone was working, my eyes were seeing something important enough to document. But my conscious mind has no access to any of it. It's been locked away or erased or hidden behind some barrier I can't cross. I still drive Highway 26. I have to. It's part of my regular routes, and avoiding it would raise questions I don't want to answer. But every time I approach that tunnel around milepost 40, my hands tighten on the steering wheel, and I feel that metallic disc embedded in the plastic. A reminder that something happened to me that night. Something I can't remember and can't explain. Something that left physical evidence I carry with me every time I drive. I've tried to access the memories, meditation, hypnosis, even just sitting quietly and trying to remember. Nothing works. That hour is just gone, a black hole in my timeline that I can't fill no matter how hard I try. Other drivers I've talked to who've experienced similar incidents say the same thing. The memories don't come back. You learn to live with the gap, with the knowledge that something happened that you weren't meant to remember or that your mind couldn't process. The object is still in my steering wheel. I've stopped trying to remove it. It's become part of the truck, part of me. Sometimes when I'm driving at night, I'll glance down at it and see those strange lights reflecting in its surface, even when there are no lights around. The mechanic said it wasn't possible, that it was just my imagination or a trick of ambient light. But I know what I see. That disc is connected to whatever happened that night, and it's still active somehow, still receiving or transmitting or doing something I can't detect or understand. I check my phone compulsively now, looking for photos I didn't take, videos I didn't record, evidence that I'm losing time again. So far, nothing since that night. But the fear is always there. The fear that I'll blink and find myself somewhere else. That hours will vanish again, that I'll discover evidence of things I did and saw but can't remember. That's worse than any monster or ghost. It's the violation of your own mind, the knowledge that you're not fully in control of your own consciousness. The missing time phenomenon is real. I have the evidence. 47 photos, 62 minutes of dashcam footage, tachograph data, GPS history, and a metallic object in my steering wheel that shouldn't exist. All of it proves something happened to me on Highway 26 that night. Something that took an hour of my life and replaced my memories with a blank void. Whatever it was, wherever those memories went, I'll never get them back. I'll just have the evidence that they existed, and the permanent reminder embedded in my steering wheel that some experiences aren't meant to be remembered, or maybe they're too significant for our minds to hold without breaking. Either way, that hour is gone, and I'm left with the evidence of my own actions that I can't recall. That's a special kind of horror that never really goes away. Wrong turns happen. You miss an exit, take a detour that doesn't go where you think, end up on a back road that adds time to your delivery. It's annoying, but not usually dangerous. You figure out where you went wrong, get back on track, maybe lose an hour. That's what I thought when my GPS glitched on Highway 20 in eastern Washington and routed me down what looked like a county road. Just a wrong turn. Just a delay. Except the place I found at the end of that road wasn't on any map. And when I tried to leave, I discovered the people living there didn't want anyone knowing they existed. I was hauling construction equipment from Spokane to a job site near Omak, running Highway 20 through some of the most remote country in Washington. Eastern Washington isn't like the western part of the state. No cities, no suburbs, just miles and miles of high desert, sagebrush, and mountains. Population density drops to almost nothing once you get away from the Columbia River. There are stretches where you can drive 30 miles without seeing another vehicle or any sign of human habitation. My GPS had been acting strange all afternoon. The screen would flicker, lose satellite signal, then reconnect, showing me in slightly different positions. I'd chalked it up to the terrain, the mountains blocking signals, normal technical issues. When it told me to take a right turn onto what appeared to be a gravel county road, I hesitated. The road wasn't marked with any signs, and it looked barely maintained. But the GPS insisted this was my route, showing it would save me 20 minutes versus staying on Highway 20. The road was rougher than I'd expected, narrow with washboard ruts that rattled my truck and made my empty trailer bounce. I kept expecting to see a sign indicating this was a legitimate county road, some number or designation that would confirm I was going the right way. Nothing. Just gravel and sagebrush and the occasional fence post. After about 15 minutes, I tried to turn around. But the road was too narrow, and there was nowhere to safely maneuver a 70-foot rig. That's when I saw the buildings. Not a town exactly, more like a compound. 30 or 40 structures arranged in a grid pattern in a valley that hadn't been visible from the road. Houses, storage buildings, what looked like a common hall or meeting house. All of them were the same style, same tan color, same design. Like someone had built a small community all at once using the same blueprint. There were vehicles parked in organized rows, gardens laid out with military precision, solar panels on every roof. And people, at least 50 of them that I could see, all wearing similar clothing. Not uniforms exactly, but similar enough to be noticeable. Tan and brown earth tones, loose-fitting, practical. They stopped what they were doing when they heard my truck approaching. Every single one of them turned to look at me, and the synchronization of it was deeply unsettling, like they'd all been waiting for someone to arrive, or like they all heard the same unspoken command. I pulled to a stop near what appeared to be the main building, engine idling, trying to figure out where I was and how to get back to Highway 20. My GPS had gone completely dark, screen black like the power had been cut. My phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual for this area. But the timing felt wrong. A man approached my truck, maybe 50 years old, with the calm expression of someone who's completely certain of their place in the world. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I rolled down my window. I think I took a wrong turn. Can you tell me how to get back to Highway 20? He nodded slowly. You're about 12 miles off the main road. This is private property. We don't usually get visitors. The way he said visitors made it clear they didn't want them either. I apologized, explained my GPS had malfunctioned, asked if I could turn around somewhere. He looked back at the compound, then at me. You'll need to back out the way you came. Road's too narrow to turn around up here. But before you go, why don't you come inside? Get some water, rest a few minutes. Long drive back to the highway. Everything in my gut told me to decline, to back my truck down that road immediately and get away from this place. But backing a loaded truck down 12 miles of narrow gravel road would take hours, and I was genuinely thirsty. I agreed, climbed down from my cab, and followed him toward the main building. That's when I noticed the cameras. Small, discreet, but everywhere. On buildings, on posts, covering every angle of the compound. I also noticed the absence of children. There were people of various ages, but no kids playing, no teenagers hanging around. Everyone was adult, everyone was working on something, and everyone was watching me without appearing to watch me. The main building was sparse inside. Long tables, folding chairs, a kitchen area that looked institutional. No decorations, no personal touches, nothing that indicated individual personality or preference. The man, who introduced himself only as Brother Michael, brought me a glass of water. It tasted fine, but I found myself wondering if I should have accepted it. Several other people had followed us inside, standing around the perimeter of the room, not saying anything, just present. I asked what this place was, trying to sound casual. Brother Michael smiled again with those eyes that didn't smile. We're a community. People who've chosen to live differently, away from the corruption and chaos of mainstream society. We grow our own food, generate our own power, take care of each other. It's peaceful here. The way he emphasized peaceful felt like a warning, like peace was something they'd fight to protect. I asked how long they'd been here. He said 15 years, that they'd purchased the land legally and built everything themselves. Completely self-sufficient, completely private. No connection to the outside world except when they chose to have one. I mentioned I hadn't seen this settlement on any maps. His expression hardened slightly. That's intentional. We value our privacy. The world doesn't need to know we're here. Something about the situation was making my skin crawl. The synchronized behavior, the surveillance cameras, the isolation, the emphasis on privacy and separation from mainstream society. I'd heard stories about compounds like this, groups that started as alternative communities and evolved into something darker. I finished my water and said I needed to get back on the road, that I had a delivery deadline to meet. Brother Michael walked me back to my truck, and that's when I saw it. Another truck parked behind one of the buildings, partially hidden by a tarp. A commercial truck, older model, with rust and faded paint. But what caught my attention was the company name still visible on the door. A trucking company I knew had gone out of business 3 years ago. The truck looked like it had been there for a while, becoming part of the compound's vehicle collection. I asked about it, trying to sound casual. Brother Michael followed my gaze, and his expression went completely neutral. Previous visitor. He decided to stay, join our community. We're always open to people who want a different life. The way he said it made it clear that staying hadn't been entirely voluntary. I felt my heart rate spike and forced myself to stay calm. I climbed into my cab, started the engine, and that's when I noticed people had positioned themselves along the road I'd come in on. Not blocking it exactly, but standing in groups, watching, waiting. Brother Michael put his hand on my door, still smiling that empty smile. You know, it's a long drive back to the highway. Dangerous, too, backing down that narrow road. Lots of drop-offs. Easy to make a mistake. Maybe you should consider staying the night. Leave in the morning when you're fresh. Every instinct screamed that leaving in the morning meant never leaving at all. I thanked him, but insisted I needed to go, that my dispatcher would send people looking if I didn't check in. His hand stayed on the door. Cell phones don't work out here. Radio either. Something about the geology, the mountains. Communications just don't make it in or out of this valley. It wasn't a warning. It was a fact, delivered with complete confidence. I put my truck in gear and started moving forward slowly, not backward like he'd suggested. There was a gap between buildings that looked wide enough, a route through the compound that might connect to another road out. Brother Michael stepped back, his expression changing from friendly to cold. "That's not the way out," he said. People started moving, converging from different parts of the compound, walking with purpose toward my truck. I didn't wait to see what they'd do. I accelerated, aiming for that gap between buildings, praying there was actually a road on the other side and not just open desert or a cliff. My mirrors showed people running now, not chasing exactly, but moving to cut off other routes. The gap was barely wide enough, my mirrors nearly clipping the buildings on both sides. I scraped through and saw with relief that there was a road, rougher than the one I'd come in on, but passable. Behind me, I saw vehicles starting up. 2 trucks, a van, moving fast. They were coming after me, and there was no way my loaded truck could outrun them on this terrain. The road climbed steeply out of the valley, switchbacks that forced me to slow down. In my mirrors, I could see them gaining. 3 vehicles in coordinated pursuit, like they'd practiced this before. The road crested a ridge, and I saw Highway 20 in the distance, maybe 2 miles away, across relatively flat ground. I pushed my speed higher than was safe, the truck bouncing violently over ruts and rocks. The vehicles behind me were close enough that I could see the drivers, their expressions focused and determined. This wasn't about asking me to come back. This was about making sure I never told anyone what I'd found. I hit Highway 20 doing 50 miles per hour, my trailer swaying dangerously as I made the turn onto pavement. The pursuing vehicle stopped at the edge of the highway, didn't follow onto the public road. In my mirrors, I watched them sit there, engines idling, just watching me drive away. Like they had an invisible boundary they wouldn't cross, a line between their world and the outside world that they'd established and wouldn't violate. I drove straight to the nearest town with a sheriff's office, 30 miles away. Told them everything, showed them where my GPS had sent me, described the compound and the people and the pursuit. The deputy listened, took notes, said he'd look into it. But his expression told me he'd heard stories like this before and knew exactly what he'd find. Nothing. Because groups like that exist in the gray areas, Technically legal, technically private property, technically within their rights, as long as they're not actively breaking laws. I went back 2 days later with a sheriff's deputy and a state trooper. We couldn't find the turnoff. Drove Highway 20 for 30 miles in both directions from where I thought it had been, looking for that gravel road. Nothing. The deputy pulled up satellite imagery on his tablet, and it showed nothing but empty desert in that area. No buildings, no roads, no sign of human habitation. But here's what keeps me awake at night. When we were driving that stretch of Highway 20, I saw fresh tire tracks. Lots of them, cutting off the highway into the sagebrush. Going somewhere. Coming back. Proof that vehicles were traveling to and from something that officially didn't exist. The deputy saw them too. He didn't say anything, just looked at them, then looked at me, then suggested we head back. I asked him directly if he knew about that compound. He was quiet for a long time before answering. Finally, he said there were places in eastern Washington that local law enforcement knew about, but couldn't do anything about. Private property, remote locations, people who'd gone off-grid legally and established communities that operated by their own rules. As long as no one filed complaints, as long as there was no evidence of crimes, there was nothing law enforcement could do. What about the truck I saw? The one from the company that went out of business? He looked uncomfortable. People choose to join these communities. Sometimes they leave their old lives behind completely. Unless someone files a missing persons report, unless there's evidence of foul play, we can't force people to leave places they've chosen to live. But the way he said chosen made it clear he had doubts about how voluntary those choices really were. I researched that trucking company when I got home, found a news article from 3 years ago about a driver who disappeared while making a delivery in eastern Washington. His truck was never found. His family filed missing persons reports, but the investigation went nowhere. No leads, no evidence, no resolution. Just another person who vanished in the vast, empty spaces of eastern Washington, where hundreds of miles separate small towns and asking questions can be dangerous. My dashcam footage from that day is stored on 3 different drives now. The compound, the pursuit, all of it recorded. I've shown it to other drivers, to journalists, to anyone who'll look. Most dismiss it as some kind of legitimate community, nothing sinister. A few recognize what I saw and tell me quietly to let it go. That there are places in the Northwest where people who want to disappear go, and poking at them is a good way to disappear yourself. I don't run routes through eastern Washington anymore. Turn down every load that would take me near Highway 20 in that area. My company thinks I'm being superstitious. But they don't argue because I've got seniority and enough goodwill built up to be picky about my routes. Other drivers can take those runs. Drivers who don't know there are settlements out there that don't appear on maps, communities that chase away anyone who stumbles across them, places where trucks and their drivers vanish and no one seems to care. The GPS error that sent me down that road? Never happened before, never happened since. Makes me wonder if it was really an error at all. If maybe they have some way of causing navigation systems to fail, rerouting drivers down that road to see who might be interested in staying. Most drivers probably refuse the invitation and leave without incident. But some, like whoever drove that truck I saw, might accept. Or might not have a choice. I still see tire tracks every time I drive past that area on Highway 20. Fresh tracks cutting off into the desert, leading nowhere that exists on any official map. Going somewhere that doesn't want to be found. Housing people who don't want to be part of the regular world, or who made the mistake of finding them and never got the chance to leave. The deputy was right. There are places law enforcement knows about but can't touch. Places that exist in the gaps between civilization, where different rules apply and questions aren't welcome. My GPS works perfectly now, but I don't trust it anymore. Don't trust any navigation system that might decide to send me down an unmarked road toward a settlement that shouldn't exist. Because out there in the remote areas of eastern Washington, in the desert valleys hidden between ridges where cell phones don't work and help is hours away, there are communities that have decided the outside world has nothing to offer them. And if you find them accidentally, if you see too much, they'll make very sure you either join them or never tell anyone what you saw. I got lucky. I got away. But that truck with the rusted company name is still there, hidden under a tarp, waiting for its driver who's never coming back to claim it. Reality is supposed to follow rules, cause and effect. Linear time. You can't be in two places at once, and you definitely can't pass the same person 7 times on a highway when they should be miles behind you. But rules only matter when reality is playing fair. And sometimes on these long, empty stretches of highway late at night, the rules stop applying. That's what I learned on I-5 near Roseburg, Oregon, when I kept passing the same hitchhiker at exit after exit, despite the mathematical impossibility of it. And when she finally waved directly at me and mouthed my name, I realized I wasn't just witnessing something strange. I was caught in it. I was running southbound from Portland to Sacramento with a load of paper products, cruising through southern Oregon around 2 in the morning. I-5 through this section is straightforward. Mostly flat with gentle curves, exits every 10 or 15 miles, serving small towns that are asleep at this hour. Traffic was minimal, just me and the occasional northbound truck passing in the other direction. Everything was normal until exit 124 near Roseburg. That's where I saw her the first time. A woman standing at the base of the exit ramp, thumb out in the classic hitchhiker pose. She was wearing a long coat, dark hair hanging loose, face partially obscured by shadow. Nothing unusual about her except the time and location. Not many people hitchhike at 2 a.m. on a highway exit. I didn't stop, never do for hitchhikers. Too many stories, too many risks. I passed her doing 65 and watched her shrink in my mirror until the darkness swallowed her up. Exit 129 came up 5 miles later. I was watching for it because I knew there was a truck stop there if I needed fuel. As I passed the exit, I saw her again. Same woman, same coat, same pose. Standing at the base of the ramp with her thumb out. I felt a prickle of unease, but told myself it couldn't be the same person. Maybe it was someone who looked similar. Maybe fatigue was making me see patterns that weren't there. I checked my speedometer. Steady 65. I checked my mirrors. No vehicles behind me that could have given her a ride. Exit 135, 6 miles further. She was there again. Same exact appearance, same position at the base of the ramp, same gesture. But this time I was paying attention to details. The way her coat hung, the angle of her arm, the tilt of her head. Identical. Not just similar. Exactly the same. Like she was frozen in that one moment and being copy-pasted to each exit. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I felt my heart rate spike. I grabbed my phone at the next rest area and pulled up a map. The exits were spaced 6 to 8 miles apart. Even if someone had picked her up at exit 124 and dropped her at exit 129, she couldn't have beaten me to exit 135. The math didn't work. I'd been maintaining highway speed the entire time with no stops. Unless she was being transported by helicopter or teleporting, there was no physical way for her to appear at 3 consecutive exits. I considered pulling over, waiting to see if she'd appear again. but something primal in my brain told me that was a terrible idea. Whatever was happening, engaging with it directly felt dangerous. So I got back on the highway and continued south, watching for exit 138. Part of me hoped she wouldn't be there. Part of me knew she would be. Exit 138. There she was. Same position, same gesture. But this time as I passed, I got a clearer look at her face. She was young, maybe late 20s, with an expression that wasn't quite right. Not distressed like you'd expect from someone stranded. Not hopeful like someone trying to catch a ride. Just blank, like she was going through the motions without any emotional connection to what she was doing. That's when I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. My license plate in the driver's side mirror. The numbers were wrong. I knew my plate number by heart after checking it thousands of times during pre-trip inspections. But the reflection showed different numbers. I blinked, looked again. The numbers shifted, changed, became something else entirely while I was looking at them. Exit 142. She was there, and now I could see that her thumb wasn't actually extended like a hitchhiker's should be. It was pointing directly at my truck as I passed. Her head turned, tracking my movement, her face visible for just a moment. Still blank, still wrong. But now there was something in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or accusation. I checked my mirrors compulsively now, watching my license plate shift and change. Sometimes it showed my actual number. Sometimes it showed sequences I didn't recognize. Once it showed letters instead of numbers. Another time it appeared backwards, mirrored correctly in the reflection, which made no logical sense. Reality was breaking down around me, losing cohesion, and that woman at every exit was somehow the focal point of it. Exit 146. This time I slowed down as I approached, some morbid curiosity overriding my fear. She was there in her usual spot, but as I got closer, her arm moved. Not the normal movement of repositioning. It jerked, stuttered, like frames of video being skipped. Her head snapped toward me with mechanical precision, and I saw her mouth move. She was saying something, or trying to. Her lips formed shapes, but I couldn't hear the words through my closed windows and the sound of my diesel engine. I accelerated hard, suddenly desperate to put distance between myself and whatever she was. My speedometer climbed to 75, faster than I should be going with a loaded trailer, but I needed to break whatever pattern was forming. The dashboard lights flickered. My radio, which had been silent, burst into static. And underneath the static, I heard something that might have been a voice, might have been my name. Exit 151. Despite my speed, despite my attempts to break free, she was there. But this time something was different. There were 7 of her. Identical figures standing in a row, all with that same pointing gesture, all with heads turned to track my truck. 7 iterations of the same impossible woman, arranged like markers or warnings, or perhaps like a countdown. I was breathing hard, panic setting in. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this couldn't be happening, that reality didn't work this way. But reality clearly had other ideas. My CB radio crackled to life, and I heard my own voice, recorded from earlier, having a conversation I didn't remember having. My GPS showed me in 3 different locations simultaneously. The mile markers I passed were counting backward instead of forward. Exit 155. She was alone again, but closer to the highway than before. Close enough that my headlights illuminated her clearly as I approached. She was looking directly at me now. Not at my truck, but at me specifically, making deliberate eye contact through my windshield. Her arm was still pointing, but now it was moving. following me as I drove past, and her mouth was forming words I could suddenly understand without hearing them. My name. She was saying my name. My full name, first and last. The name my mother gave me that's not on my license or my truck paperwork. The final exit before the California border was coming up. Exit 159. I knew with absolute certainty she would be there, and I knew something fundamental would change when I passed her this time. The air in my cab felt charged, electric. The fabric of reality felt thin, like tissue paper about to tear. Everything was building toward something, and I was trapped in the momentum of it. Exit 159. She was standing in the middle of the exit ramp, not at the base anymore. Standing where I'd have to look directly at her, where there could be no avoiding eye contact. And as I approached, she raised both arms, not pointing anymore, waving directly at me with both hands, and her face was no longer blank. She was smiling, a smile that recognized me, that knew me, that had been waiting for me. Her mouth moved, and this time I heard it clearly despite the impossibility. My name spoken in a voice that was familiar and wrong, that sounded like every voice I'd ever heard overlapped and synthesized into something that approximated human speech. She said my name, and then she said something else. "You're late. You were supposed to arrive 6 exits ago." I crossed into California, and she was gone. The exits ahead showed no one. The highway returned to normal, and the sense of reality being on the verge of collapse faded. My license plate in the mirror showed my actual number. My radio and GPS functioned normally. The mile markers counted forward in proper sequence. Everything was as it should be, as if the previous 20 exits had never happened. But I know they did. I have the dash cam footage showing her at every exit, always in the same position until those final ones where she multiplied and moved and spoke my name. I've reviewed that footage dozens of times, and it's different each time I watch it. Details change. The number of iterations at exit 151 varies between 7 and 12. The words she mouths at exit 159 shift depending on when I review the footage. The video itself is unstable, refusing to maintain a single version of events. Other drivers on trucker forums have reported similar experiences. Always on I-5 in that section. Always a hitchhiker who appears at multiple exits impossibly. Always the sense that reality is breaking down, that the normal rules have been suspended. Some say it's a glitch in the simulation we live in. Others think it's a ghost trapped in a loop, repeating the same moment over and over. A few believe it's something testing us, seeing how we react when the impossible becomes real. I don't know what she was, why she was calling my name. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stopped, if I'd tried to pick her up at one of those exits. I don't know what she meant when she said I was late, or where I was supposed to arrive. The mystery sits in my mind like a splinter, something I can't remove and can't ignore. Because she knew my name, my real name, and that means whatever she was connected to me specifically. Not just any driver on that highway. Me. I've driven that stretch of I-5 twice since then. Both times during daylight when reality feels more solid, when the rules are more likely to hold. I haven't seen her again. But every exit I pass, I check the ramp, half expecting to see her standing there with her arm raised. And every time I check my license plate in the mirror, I hold my breath until I confirm the numbers are correct. Because I know now that reality is thinner than we think, that it can fray and come apart in specific places at specific times. And I know that something out there knows my name and is waiting for me at exits that may or may not exist, calling me toward a destination I never agreed to reach. The highway continues. The exits keep coming. And somewhere in the space between what's real and what's possible, she's still there. Still pointing. Still speaking names into the night. Still waiting for drivers who are late for appointments they never made. I don't know if I'll see her again, but I know she's there. And I know that if I do see her, if she appears in my mirrors or at the base of an exit ramp, it will mean reality is fracturing again. And this time, I might not make it through before it completely breaks apart. If these stories have left you questioning what's real and what's waiting out there on the dark highways of the Pacific Northwest, you're not alone. The road holds secrets that most people never encounter. But those of us who drive through the night know the truth. Reality is thinner than it appears, and sometimes it tears. For more stories like these, stories that explore the darkness waiting just beyond your headlights, subscribe to Verified Fears. Because the highway never ends, and neither do the things that walk beside it, waiting for their moment to step into your world and call your name.